I would like to, Roshni, and now, first of all, I would like to ask Ken to give just a quick introduction to how we deal with the questions, and then we let Roshni talk. Ken, over to you.
Thanks very much, Verena. I'll just turn on my camera briefly. So you will see along the top of the toolbar there, if you are on MS Teams, and only on MS Teams. If you're dialing in, I'm afraid this won't work. To the left of the people icon, or to the right of the people icon, and to the left of the raise your hand button is a little chat box. If you click on that box, it'll give you the opportunity to enter questions in the chat box there. Verena will be keeping an eye on them throughout the talk, so all you need to do is enter a question there and we'll take it from there. Just be mindful that that's a kind of a public box and anybody can read the questions, and also perhaps if you see a question being asked, then there's no need for you to ask that question yourself. The last thing I want to alert you to is that I've started recording the meeting and we're going to have this on our website at a future date, so I just wanted to let you know about that. And back to Verena and Roshni.
Thank you very much, Ken. And Roshni just told me beforehand that unfortunately, because she is running her slides herself, you know, that she can only do either show herself or show the slides. So we think, you know, maybe you show the slides now, and when you are done, you will show us your face as well. Is that possible?
Yeah, that's the plan, Verena. Once I stop the slides, I can put on my video, it seems.
Very good. Thank you. So over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Verena and Ken, and to Cancer Trials Ireland for inviting me to share my experience in opening a clinical trial with the support of Cancer Trials Ireland. So I'm really directing today's talk at registrars, mainly who might be in my shoes now, where I was about 5 years ago, at which stage I would have had some years of experience in oncology from the clinical side of things behind me. I would have been a sub-investigator, like many registrars are on trials, but I would have had no experience in terms of designing or writing or overseeing a clinical trial. So that's the main kind of people I'm focusing, and hopefully you'll find it useful. But just to set the scene a little, I suppose that any trial, probably in terms of pushing it through, you'd really want, it has to be something that sparks your own interest and something that you're particularly interested in pursuing. And the idea really, as Verena said, I have a particular interest in ovarian cancer and the BRCA dysfunction side of things. And when you look back around 2014, 2015, there was the realization that ovarian cancers had a fairly heavy burden of BRCA mutations, and this would have initially implications if we were to screen them routinely for the patients themselves in terms of the risk of cancers, and but also the risk of preventing cancers in their relatives. And then there coming through with PARP inhibitors looking like very promising drugs in this field. So it was all getting very exciting on that, and then they were recommending routine testing for ovarian cancer patients. And we look back to Ireland around the same time. Referral for ovarian cancer was very much based on your risk factor questionnaires through clinical genetics. And Professor Green himself had written an article around that time in the Irish Examiner, highlighting that the big issue we had in Ireland was the timely access to genetic services. So there was a big discrepancy in terms of what was being pushed in the States and what was coming through and what we were experiencing over here. And at the time, I was working, doing in the wet lab, really doing research under the supervision of Brian Hennessy. And he happened to have he has links from his own previous research with industry, with scientists, and he basically, as part of my own research, we were indirectly looking at BRCA testing in ovarian cancer. So he had links with industry in terms of pursuing testing, and he sort of came back to me from one of the meetings with them around kind of late 2015, saying that there was a new BRCA test coming in, and from a particular company, and they were looking to test it out, and they were offering free tests. And seeing as in Ireland we were lagging behind a bit with this, and we thought, well, we're doing it in my samples in a retrospective basis, and maybe we should be looking at doing this prospectively. So that's kind of how the idea came to. It was an unmet need in Ireland, and it just so happened that when I say fortuitous circumstances here on the slide, a number of things sort of come together. The fact that I was doing research in the laboratory, it didn't mean I wasn't busy at all, but it meant that my time was my own, so I could take on a project. And I think that's one thing with opening a clinical trial. You really need to be able to invest a lot of time into doing such a thing. And you need the resources for this. And obviously, the fact that my mentor happened to also be Cancer Trials Ireland vice clinical lead at the time and now clinical lead, and the fact that there was a network that he had or his lab had where I was based at the time with industry looking at this particular research area that we were interested in and links with scientists, it sort of allowed us to have the idea, but also feel in the immediate sense that concretely we could potentially move this. At the time, he was saying to me fairly quickly, you put this together fairly quickly and bring this forward as an interesting project that would allow us to get an idea in Ireland what the BRCA mutation rates were, which we didn't have a clue of that at the time, and whether we could facilitate BRCA testing a bit more easily than it was being done through the genetic service in Ireland. So that's using my own experience how the idea came on, but it's about identifying a clinical need that is of interest to you, because, as I said, it does require a lot of time and investment of your own time to bring this forward. So you do have to find it interesting, and having a mentor, I think certainly at a stage, if you haven't any experience in designing clinical trials, I think that is pretty much essential to guide you along the way, certainly in initially designing the study, but also in terms of your mentor would often have links that you might not have established yet to try and bring the study forward. And so then once the idea is kind of becoming a little bit more concrete, it's about taking the initial plunge and trying to bring this study into the fore a little bit more and actually progress it to becoming something substantial. And the way we did this is initially, obviously, I would have done an initial draft of what my key rationale was, what was the aims and the endpoints, and what were we looking to achieve with the study. But then rather than bringing it forward directly to sponsor to potentially move the study forward, we spent actually a lot of time in talking to the key stakeholders that would be involved in such a study. So, clinical oncologists or geneticists and everybody basically that would be required to either facilitate the study, but also beneficiaries, to talk to people about, this is the idea we have, how do you think we should proceed, engage the interest. And the reason it's worth doing that is you will obviously have people more on board if you take everybody's ideas into consideration. And yes, you want to design a study that everybody's agreeable with, so that when you do get to the point of opening it, it will actually be of interest to people and it will actually accrue. So initially it was very much informal inquiries towards relevant consultants involved in this field and who would also have an interest in pushing this forward. So it was basically by emails or meeting people, surreptitiously and saying, oh, well, we're looking into doing this trial, and what do you think? And so that was just the informal stage. And then I think one thing that really helped in my case, and I think could be applied to several studies, was that Dr. O'Donnell, who was one of the first, Derval O'Donnell, who I did the informal inquiries to, mentioned bringing it up at an all-Ireland ovarian cancer conference that was happening the following 6 weeks, which made complete sense, because at that conference, not only would you have most of the Irish people who would be dealing with patients with ovarian cancer and in this BRCA setting, but you'd also have international experts who come to these conferences, and getting their opinions would be key. And in my case in particular, we had Stephen Narod at this conference, who is sort of an international, leading expert when it comes to clinical genetics in the BRCA field. So it was fantastic. Yes.
Can I just ask everybody else, please, going on mute, and just let Roshni talk, please? Thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, that's no problem. That's no problem. So I think when you're in the stage of designing your study, informal kind of inquiries are useful to try and progress it forward in terms of looking at key people who would potentially be involved in this field. And then if you have the opportunity to bring it to, and we have lots of meetings in Ireland, you know, whether it's in the colorectal field, melanoma, we often have, you know, meetings where we would bring in international experts for education purposes. And what we did was we set up a little forum at one of these meetings, sent people the design, the draft design ahead of time, explained what the purpose of this forum was, and any interested party could come in and chip in. And it worked out really well. In fact, one of the consultants came back to me saying that the discussion was rather heated, but that was probably a good thing. That people were interested in this topic, and that if we were to carry forward, there would be an uptake in terms of accruing study. So I think that we spent a good sort of 3 or 4 months going to and fro before getting down to what I would call draft design version 2. And I think that that's important to take that time to do that, so that you do design your study in a way that will end up being of interest to the people who you want to take up on. Once we got to that stage, it was about progressing it to a point where we could set it more formally. And the next step was to propose the study at the disease-specific subgroup at one of the quarterly meetings at Cancer Trial Ireland. In my case, it went to the translation and the gynecology subgroup, but obviously you target your study to the relevant subgroup. And for me, it was easy to do that because obviously I was working with Brian, who was vice clinical lead, so he just put me in touch with Verena and basically told me how to do it. But it is fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of contacting the lead DSSG in Cancer Trial for whatever subgroup your trial might fall into. And I'll show you the next slide, which is basically the Cancer Trials Ireland has a template and has many other templates which are very useful. But I'll start with this one, which was the initial template to identify your study concept and put in your resource plan and requirements that you think you might need from Cancer Trials Ireland. So it's just about filling a brief 3-page form with your title, a basic rationale, your interested colleagues, any aims. So a basic study design in terms of your rationale, your endpoints, what might be your arms if it's an interventional study, or what are the endpoints in terms of if it was something translational. How many patients you plan to include? Do you have funding? Are you collaborating with anybody else on this study? So it's a straightforward enough concept, doesn't require too much time, but it's the initial proposal that goes in at the disease-specific subgroup. And that's the second part of the form, which is your resource plan requirement in terms of what would be your anticipated resources required from Cancer Trials Ireland. And that's the first time I saw what Cancer Trials could offer in terms of supporting the design and the running of the study. So the resources would be in terms of either project management with protocol development, or monitoring, data management, statistics. So these were the various aspects that you put in your form as to what you think you might require. So that completed concept then gets presented at a particular DSSG meeting, and you put up 2 or 3 slides to present your concept at the meeting. Usually the people who are there have heard about it already if you've done your initial sort of, stakeholder interest. And if the parties at the DSSG would like to carry this an agreement that's an interesting study and would like to carry it forward, then Verena comes back to you with just kind of refining a little bit the form, and she sends it out. Well, for me it was Verena, it might be someone else, but for international peer review. And while that goes off, because it does take perhaps a couple of months or so to come back to us, I, at that stage, would have started looking a little bit more. I mean, we'd already started a little bit of looking into funding, but that's when you start working on developing your protocol and writing it, and start looking for funding sources, which I'll go through a little bit more in detail. I'll just go through a little bit of unexpected challenges, because that was the sequence of how I started off the study with this draft protocol that was sent out for international peer review, with the idea being that we were getting these free BRCA tests from a company that was just launching their new BRCA test. And then they turn around and say that the funding went through and we suddenly do not have free BRCA testing. So I was at the initial stages, we sent peer review, and my initial plan of a nice, we'll write the protocol, we'll follow what they say, and we'll get to the end and initiate the study sort of started crumbling a little bit already. So the first thing is that the test fell through. And you're wondering then what to do. And we looked at all options and said, well, if we went to the same company and paid for the test, what would they cost us? So you look at various options. And in my case, I completely, by again, one of these fortuitous circumstances, I had worked on my the lab in St. James's was looking into doing tBRCA testing themselves, and then I hear as well that the lab in Beaumont is looking into doing this. So there's a bit of.
It's Ken. Yes. Apologies, we've lost your slides, I think.
Oh, have you?
You may just need to share the screen again. If that's an issue, I do have backup slides. Just let me know.
Okay, so I'll stop sharing and try again and see. My screen, it's still not shared, is it?
Not from mine.
Not yet.
No, okay, I'll try again there. How's that? Did that work?
No, we just see your icon.
That's okay. I'm gonna load up. I have a version of the slides here, so just bear with me 1 second.
Okay.
Start with the wonderful challenge slide. I like that. Really good one.
The finalizing the study design. Yeah, I mean, it was just felt like there was always something, that came in the way. But I think that's just part and parcel of trying to set things up, when you're designing a study.
Yeah, and I think, but it is so normal. I mean, everybody who ever did it had came across this. There are these challenges in between. You think you're flying just
exactly. You just think, yeah.
It's not happening.
No, it doesn't work that way. And I think I just try one last time. Did this work? No. In terms of sharing the screen.
I believe that I'm sharing my screen. Perhaps that's wrong.
No, I mean, Ken, we can't see anything at the moment. At Roshni, it shows like Roshni has the screen.
Try me again, because I tried a different way of sharing my screen.
Yeah, there it is.
That's my screen sharing. Sorry about the interruption, everybody. Roshni, if you just say my name when you want to press on with a slide, I'll just go ahead. I'm going back on mute now.
So your screen is sharing now, is it, Ken?
Correct, yes.
Okay. So let me just. Oh yes, I see it there. Okay. So none of my animations will work, but that's okay. I'll just put my camera on then, see. Okay. So I was just saying, so yeah, so sometimes though things work for the better, because it meant that it filled a better purpose, in that we then spent a lot of time trying to develop tumor BRCA testing in Ireland, which was not something that existed. So it required spending the guts of 6 to 9 months, perhaps even a year, really trying to develop and coordinate a testing pathway, a new testing pathway between the labs in James's and Beaumont and Crumlin, which was a lot of work, because you've got lots of people involved to try and develop a single pathway as part of your study, and that has to be sound before you bring it forward. So when you look at my timeline on my next slide later on, part of the reason maybe my study took a little bit longer to bring forward was this big issue, which was completely unexpected, that we would lose something that was actually quite simple and given, and which turned out into then having to myself sit down and develop a whole pathway that was non-existent in Ireland. Now it worked out for the better, because it's great to be able to do things locally, but these things do take time, because you're trying to coordinate lots of people. I mean, Verena might remember at some point it took me, and I'm not joking, 2.5 months to try and coordinate everybody's times. There was about 10 people I wanted to get into a room to talk about how we would do this pathway, and to try and get everybody at the right time. That in itself took about 2.5 months. So, but anyway, we did get to a point of agreeing a pathway that we would be doing germline and tumor testing in Ireland, and it was looking great because it looked even better if we could do it in Ireland. And then it turned out that the germline testing validation wasn't going through. There was resource issues for germline testing. There was staffing issues to allow the germline testing to happen properly. So in the end, we had to outsource it to the UK, which was not ideal, but I suppose you just have to adapt along the way to see if it's still acceptable to put the study along, despite it not being your initial preference. And then we had the big gap there with the clouds around the same time. We got word that our main funding body, who had initially been very enthusiastic, decided to halve our budget, which then meant that 2 of the endpoints of the study, which were very interesting clinical questions, and well, one was a very interesting clinical question that hadn't been answered, and the other was more about the way we do the testing to make it a little bit stronger. It had to be scrapped. So, you know, it just means you have to adapt your trial design, where you started off on that nice, lovely stroll on the bike to get to the end. We'll have to adapt depending on your priorities and what's available to you to proceed. And hopefully what's available to you isn't so bad that you can't even proceed the study. When we were able to pull it through, just meant it took a little bit more time and persistence and effort to do it. And as the arrow shows, it was the guts of 1 year to redirect a new pathway that would be valid for the study. You can move to the next slide there, Ken. So this gives you an idea. I thought it would be really useful to, because I didn't expect it necessarily to take so long. Now, I highlighted in my previous slide one of the big reasons why it took longer, but the process, there's a lot of to and fro in the various parties involved in developing the study. And so I thought it would be very useful to give you an idea of the timeline in terms of the time you would need to invest if you wanted to open a study in Ireland. As I said, bearing in mind that you probably could remove the guts of 9 months to a year, because in my case, it was this whole development of protocol of the pathway that had to be rejigged and looked into. But basically, if you go at the start of the arrow, and again, I don't have my animation, so, but if you follow at the first dot, this is the point that Verena would have sent the study off for international peer review. And this goes off, and it's just to you get comments back in terms of your study and whether it is a sound study scientifically that it would be worth carrying through. So we heard that was sent off around December, so obviously with Christmas, a little bit of delays. We heard back late February, and in March, we made a few amendments based on some minor comments on the peer review. Luckily, they came back with positive and interested comments that they were happy to pursue the study. So once we had made the amendments and sort of finalized a bit of a draft as to what sort of endpoints we would look at, it's then looking into seeing, well, now we have an idea of how this is going to do costing and devising of the budget. And that happened around June of 2017. Just to go back on one point actually about the international peer review, it's actually a really useful process because the peers would come back with other ideas that you mightn't have thought about that may strengthen the study. And in my case, 2 ideas that were added on were to consider adding a biobank, seeing as we were collecting tissue samples anyway. And the other was to include a health economic analysis. And the biobank, we decided it was actually going to be far too much work in terms of amending the protocol and what wouldn't be involved. So we parked that. But it is useful to have the extra ideas, and then you decide whether it's worth and feasible to include it into your study. So we did include the health economic analysis as one of the endpoints. So anyway, so then we moved to costing and devising a budget, which Cancer Trials Ireland is very helpful in this regard in terms of their costs at their site, in terms of, you know, study sites, patient accruals, and then the administrative costs of, from a statistics point of view or a data manager's point of view. So they're very helpful that way. And then on your end, you might have to provide some costing depending on what your intervention on your study. So I would have done the costing, talking to the labs in terms of the cost of actually doing the tests. So with those two, you come up with a budget, which is what your funders are going to require. And I'll talk a little bit about funding in the next slide. So that was around June. And at this stage, we are getting to a point where we have a solid design. In the background, this pathway was being developed, but we were getting to a stage where we had an idea what pathway we were going to do. So we got a solid enough study where we then moved to a stage where we have to send out feasibility questionnaires. So you have your study design, and you look at potentially what sites and what hospital sites in Ireland you would open your study. And basically, we would have sent out the questionnaires to all hospitals in Ireland that would deal with cancer to look and see, would these sites be interested in the study? Would they be able to accrue based on the eligibility criteria? And so again, there's a template for these feasibility questionnaires that Cancer Trials Ireland provides in terms of how to fill, and there's great guidance, which I'll talk about later in terms of filling those forms. So the forms get sent out to the sites, and it took about 3 months from the time of designing the forms, sending them out, and hearing back from the sites in terms of how many patients they think they could accrue based on the eligibility criteria. And then obviously you sort of tend to select the sites that will likely accrue the most patients, and based on your budget. We had budget to open 5 sites. So we picked the 5 hospitals that would be most likely to accrue the highest number of patients to meet our targets. So at this stage, we have a protocol that is nearing finalization, and in the background of all this happening, there's constant emails to and fro between myself and Cancer Trials Ireland, trying to further develop and agree on the protocol and the various aspects of it. Because once the funding would be secured, the main thing was to get the protocol to ethics so that we could open at sites. So to get to that stage, what you really need to have finalized is the actual protocol itself and the patient information leaflet. Those 2 things would be mandatory for ethics submission. There's a lot of other paperwork, like questionnaires to patients and clinicians on my study, or CRFs that need designing, but that can be done. I mean, it's going on in the background, but what you really need to finalize to submit to ethics are the protocol and the patient information leaflet. So there's a lot of things happening in parallel, but if you were to take it stepwise, once we've had our feasibility and selected our sites, the scientific meeting group in Cancer Trial Ireland needs to then approve the study. And once that's done, you wait for, in our case, then funding was secured around June 2018. So we're over a year out, year and a half out now, from the initial kind of idea of putting this together. So it does take a bit of time, and that period actually is what would have taken the longest time. Once you get to starting to send out feasibility questionnaires, things are starting to move a little bit faster, partly because once the funding is secured, in our case it was from a pharmaceutical company, there are clear deadlines. Well, clear, obviously you can move the goalposts a little bit, but there's generally time frames that they want in terms of when the contract should be signed, when submission to ethics should be done, when the first patient needs to be on study. So things sort of have to move at that stage in terms of meeting those timelines and hopefully not losing your funding. So once we finally, but even after the time the funding was secured, my expectation is right, funding is secured, we've got the protocol approved, everything is ready to go, we just need to sign contracts. But even then, there's a lot of to and fro and nitty-gritty details, and everything has to be kind of perfectly reviewed, and every party has to be happy. So when I look back and count back the time, it took months between having the funding secured to actually signing the contracts and being ready to go. In parallel to this, once we had funding secured, and there needs to be a little bit of funding up front, because a little bit of money is required to proceed to the ethics submission process, which we're very lucky that Cancer Trials Ireland basically does on your behalf, obviously with your input, but it's a huge amount of paperwork, particularly as in Ireland, we do not have a centralized ethics submission process. So each hospital ethics group has to had an individual submission. So we had to do 5 submission to ethics, which turned out to be 6 because one of the sites in the end didn't work out. So that's a lot of work. And it happens in a phased process because you can't send to all sites at the same time. It took about 3 or 4 months to eventually submit to every ethics committee. And then they take about 3 months or so to get back to you with their amendments, if there are any. And luckily, most of sites did not require any amendments. And again, that goes back to taking the time initially when you're at the stage of involving the stakeholders and making sure everybody would be pretty much happy with the way you're designing your study. And in my case, it involved genetic testing, which is a minefield for ethics committees. So you really want to try and nail it down as well as possible, which would then make the ethics process a lot more smooth and as a result, a time-saving process. So there was only one site, if I recall correctly, that required some minor amendments. So luckily, you know, we were able to move very quickly from the time of submission to approval. And then once ethics was approved, I was like, yay, we're finally there. When are we going to initiate at sites? And then even that takes a bit of time because coordinating everybody at the right time. So I remember first site where the ethics was approved was Limerick, and that was in October. And I thought, great, November, we can approve. And we had a little bit of pressure getting our first patient in by the last quarter of 2018. But then trying to get everybody available at the right time for the site initiation visit, whether it was from Cancer Trial Ireland or the hospital. We also needed a genetics counsellor for our particular study to be present. In the end, the first site was initiated just over 3 months later. But then, luckily, they were very quick, and we finally got our first patient enrolled 6 weeks after the site initiation. So the idea of the timeline here was just to show you that it takes time to get from your initial idea to your first patient on study. And as I said, in my case, you know, the nearly an extension of a year. So I suppose if you have your funding pretty much ready to go and a study design that is sound and doesn't have as many hurdles as we would have had at the start, you know, you might be looking maybe at the guts of a year from the time you're kind of putting the study forward at the SSG as a study concept to the time it opens, I think at best. But Verena might be able to give a bit more insight, seeing as she's done this a lot more rather than my insight on a single trial. You can move to the next slide there, Ken. So one of the challenges was obtaining funding. As I said, this fell through for us at an early stage when it came to funding the actual cost of the tests. Our plan had been, seeing as we had the tests funded, we would be able to easily get the small amount, because the tests themselves were well over half the cost of the overall budget. So the additional cost we thought we'd be able to manage between either a small grant or charities. But then that fell through, so we had to look at other options. And again, this comes back to, you know, milking your network in terms of network and links with industry or scientists or patient advocacy groups. In this case, I knew someone who had good links with the ovarian cancer charities, so that allowed us to sort of approach them directly and quickly. And then on the other hand, you know, one of the companies that was leading with the PARP inhibitors that would be interested in such a project was then interested to fund it, because there was this gap in Ireland of patients not being routinely tested. So we went through mainly pharma, which you might find a lot of studies go through in terms of funding. And if you do go through pharma, they have a very specific process. Actually, you can move to the next slide at this stage, I think. Yes. So pharma have a process called the ESR, the externally sponsored research. So in my case, it was an online basis, but they have a clear process. But from the time we approached, this took time as well, from the time we approached the company, and then this was at a local Irish level, and then they took nearly 3 months in terms of to and fro to get the study even kind of interested by the global worldwide group. once they had that, we submitted the protocol, and it took another 3 months for them to say, yes, we're definitely interested on the protocol, and please formally submit through their online platform. So once you do submit, then they take up to 3 months to come back to you for potentially feedback and any amendments, and then it took another further 3 months then for them to actually approve it and basically say that we like the idea, but can you now submit the formal protocol so that they can fine-comb and detail the protocol and make sure that it's you know, in line with the initial concept and agreeable to them. And again, there's a lot of to and fro here. They might come back to you with some changes, and there were luckily, again, only some minor amendments. Again, it boils down to the spending a good bit of time at the start to design a study that you know, all parties agree would work well. And then it took about 2 months with a bit of to and fro to finally approve the protocol. And I can't see the last bit of my slide there, but oh yeah, and then as I said, when I thought great, funding is secured, we're ready to go, there was still about 4 months between the sponsor, Cancer Trials Ireland, and the company to actually get contracts signed. So actually in total, when I look back, it took about 20 months from the time I first met the pharmaceutical rep to having contracts signed and everything approved. So it can be a lengthy process. So the idea is to really, once you're as I said on my previous slide, once you've kind of got the study through and there's interest and you have a sponsor and you're sending it for peer review, you immediately start working on the protocol and securing funding. And hopefully, if you're lucky, there's funding secured already before you even get to that stage. But I said we didn't have enough funding from pharma, so I also had to go through charities. And there I dealt with about 3 charities, and each process in each charity is different. One was a smaller charity that had a kind of smaller, I suppose, formal structure, and it was a little bit more informal, and as a result, quicker to get funding approved. But another charity was a slightly bigger charity, and they had a proper board and a medical liaison person who was assigned to review any requests for funding. And you know, that process took a good 9 months of getting to that person, waiting for them to come back to you, and then them putting it to their board and the board coming back. So that took about 9 months with the second charity then to get to approval. And I didn't go into detail, we applied for a few small grants, but I won't go into the detail of that. That's a whole process in terms of applying for grants, but unfortunately they didn't come through. Next slide then. So then in this whole process, and I'm not just saying this just because Verena and Ken are there, but I think engaging with Cancer Trials Ireland, for me, who was a complete novice, was absolutely essential and completely invaluable to actually getting my idea from this 3-sheet paper template that Verena gave me to actually getting it off the road and running, and actually close to accrual there only in the last few days. So in terms of starting my engagement, I said it was very easy because I think most of us are linked in with mentors who have a link of some form to Cancer Trials Ireland. So once you approach the GSHE, it's very easy to get in. And once you're linked in with whoever the relevant people are, in my case, it was Orla and Anne-Marie, who were really fantastic from the start. So there's a number of things that there's a setup in terms of the process required to get to a study initiation. And once you're linked in with the person who would be overseeing your study at Cancer Trials Ireland, they very much guide you completely along the way as to how to proceed. So in terms of my support systems during the study, I would have seen Brian, my mentor at the complete start, and all the clinicians in that as my big support system at the start, in terms of throwing in the ideas, in terms of the study design, and making sure that the design would hopefully get to a point when it comes to accrual, people actually do accrue because people are interested to participate. But once we got to the stage that, okay, we've agreed on the design, and now it's about formalizing it and putting it into a practical model and getting over the standard processes to get it to opening study, that Cancer Trials Ireland was basically my go-to people. I mean, I was just liaising constantly with Anne-Marie and Orla. So just in terms of getting started, again, there are templates. And so basically what I did is I took the template for writing a protocol that Cancer Trials Ireland had. I downloaded some other templates, which you can get from protocols. At the time, they were available on the Cancer Trials Ireland site. I'm not sure if they still are. But I basically downloaded other translational studies protocols just to give an idea of how it was phrased and how it was done. And from there, I basically wrote the protocol. It took sitting down, as I said, my time was my own at the time. I was doing research in a lab, so I could sort of park the PhD work for a little bit and focus on this. And it took me the guts of a month with to and fro's to sort of have a completed protocol and pill. But then there is still a lot of to and fro, you know, from the point of, okay, we have draft 1 that was at the end of January, and it wasn't until June where we got to a finalized agreed draft that had been fine combed again and again and again and again between Orla and Anne-Marie, with comments coming back and forth, and then running it by the various parties who would be involved in Cancer Trials Ireland in terms of actually delivering the study. And this would be the data managers, the statisticians, so the various parties that would be involved in terms of whatever was required to get the study up and running. So that was absolutely essential. And there's so many steps along the way, that things that I wouldn't have thought about that would have been raised by Orla and Anne-Marie, because they do this day in, day out, and they're aware of the issues that can arise. They can aware of how ethics might see a particular issue and how might be the best way to phrase it or deal with it. So there was a lot of advice, which was invaluable and of great support, and without which I don't think I could have done this, you know, on my own. So aside from actually devising the protocol and the procedures for it, Cancer Trials Ireland would offer budget costing in terms of their costs. So that was another aspect that had to be dealt, and I merged that with my own costings from the actual testing process to devise a final budget of what the study would involve. And again, there's a lot of support there. There is statistician support, which I availed of, in terms of not analyzing yet at the moment, but in terms of making sure the statistics written in the protocol were sound, and in some cases, you know, making sure that they would be sound in terms of going through the process. And then a huge load in this is the ethics submission. It's a huge amount of paperwork to do this, to finally submit a protocol to ethics. And I think if I was doing it on my own, especially at 5 sites, you probably add another 6 months to a year to actually getting the study up on the road. Obviously, you're involved in writing it and doing it, but the actual process of communicating with ethics and knowing the fact that they do it all the time, it's a lot smoother. And then we finally get to the stage of study initiation. So I think, I think it would have been very difficult for me to get to that point without the help that I would have had at Cancer Trials Ireland, who are, I suppose, set up in terms of doing this and would guide you along the way. Sorry, I'm clicking here, but Ken, if we could move on to the next slide. I suppose in my own personal experience, and this is just how things worked out, and giving you my own my own experience as to how this worked out. This is me on the left in the lab with my 2 little priorities. I mean, I know I put coffee, and obviously there was the research at the back, but I'm there focusing on the one study and emailing Anne-Marie and Orla going, so what's happening with this, and have we heard back from this? And you have to bear in mind, Anne-Marie and Orla are not just dealing with tBRCA, they're dealing with all the other translational studies, and they have a lot to deal with. So I think it was important throughout to keep regular communication about the study, because there are so many steps and there are so many issues and there are so many things that need to be chased up to get to a point of getting the study up and running. So I think it is important to have a very active involvement, because Cancer Trials Ireland actually offers such a good support system. Sometimes, and they are actually so helpful that sometimes Orlando and Marie, I think, would probably volunteer to do things themselves, but I think it's important for you as if you're designing the program, to be as involved as you can be, partly is from a time-saving point of view, partly from your own gaining experience, but I think it's very important to keep the contact regularly. I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, let's send out the feasibility questionnaires and leave it at that. And you might not, it's important to basically keep a communication all the time, and to make sure things are moving, make sure you see how you can help as much as possible to get this off the road, and get it to a stage of where we'll be able to initiate. And the reason I put a comb there next to Orla and Anne-Marie, it's because there really is a lot of fine attention to detail that I would have missed, and perhaps I wouldn't have seen as potentially being issues when it goes to ethics, but literally everything is gone through in the protocol so as to make sure that it's as perfect as can be, hopefully, when it goes to ethics. And I suppose the fact that we didn't have many amendments is a proof of the pudding that it is worthwhile going through all the kind of minutiae and detail and to and fro emails of getting the protocol as perfect as can be. So, sorry, Ken, next slide. So I think if we were to summarize, and the tips and treats comes from the current Halloween frenzy in my household. But the idea here in terms of tips, I think the key things at the start is if you are, I mean, obviously if you've designed a trial before and, done this before, then obviously you'd have experience. But if you're in my shoes where it hasn't been done before, having a mentor or a supervisor who is familiar with the process and familiar with the ways to get to a study design, and who also probably would have a lot of networking links to facilitate the development of the study design, is key in the initial process. And as I said initially, I think it is very important to really spend a lot of time, a lot of to and fro debating with the stakeholders involved to think through and design a protocol that people feel is useful. And so as a result, they will actually adopt the study when it comes out. And that's through the initial networking and, as I said, brainstorming perhaps at a meeting with international experts. And I think ultimately you'll find it is time saving, because you're not coming, if you have it well designed at the start, you're less likely to take time and less time involved in developing the protocol, but also when it goes to ethics, that hopefully wouldn't be as much coming back to you. I think you should definitely, funding takes time to come through, unless you happen to come with funding, which if you're lucky, that's the case, that there is funding available and you're designing the study, great. But certainly funding takes time to come through. And it's something you would have to source yourself for if you want to open a study to Cancer Trials Ireland. So it's something to work on upfront. And when it comes to dealing with Cancer Trials Ireland, go straight up to the DSSG, because that'll get the process up and running once it goes to international peer review, and sort of things that take off once you're linked in with Cancer Trials Ireland, will guide you along the process and doing the process to maintain regular communication so as to get the study from the initial design concepts to initiation as quick as possible. That's my 2 cents worth, I guess, or 3, in terms of hopefully providing a few tips in terms of getting a trial up and running in Ireland.
Thank you so much, Roshni. That was a really very good summary of a huge amount of work. I would like to just give the top on this talk now. If I remember correctly, the first patient was in December 19?
No, January 19th. March 19.
Sorry, March 19. And
the first patient came on.
I'm happy to say that by today, there are only 2 slots left in an accrual target of 200. And these slots are already assigned to sites, because we had, over the last few days, an amazing accrual rate coming in for this study. So well done, reaching the accrual in such a time frame. it shows that it had been really well designed and well prepared.
Yeah, and I think it also reflects the fact that if you pick an unmet clinical need, your accrual is likely to be, you know, I suppose more positive, if you like. You know, there obviously it is a highlight of a need that is there in Ireland still. So,
definitely,
you know, yeah.
Can we have you on a picture, maybe?
Oh, you can't see me, can you?
No, we can't see you.
That's strange because my I actually am visible, and it says my camera is. I'll try and turn it off and on again.
Okay.
Any luck?
I echo that. I don't know what we're going to do now that tBRCA is closed. I don't know how we're going to get our patients tested. So
yeah,
it's an unmet need, and well done for bringing it through.
Thank you. Thanks, Dervla.
And but I have to also say, I mean, you gave a lot of kudos to Cancer Trials Ireland, and really thank you so much for that. And I know Orla and Anne-Marie are dynamos in that team, and they really worked so well with you. But I also have to give you, I have to say that you are an exceptional investigator as well. You were so engaged. You were absolutely always open for any questions, for any suggestions, for to also engage with other stakeholders and things, which is so important, as you mentioned as well, you know, because that if you do not do that, then things go slower. Definitely.
Yeah, no, that's definitely, you know, I suspect you could add on an extra year to the whole process by not maintaining engagement and constant, you know, bringing things to the fore again and again. And I suppose you could look at it as pestering as well, but you know, I think it is needed, though. You know, I mean, you have to push for what you're trying to do. You know, so remaining engaged and proactive, I think, is key here. You know, I think in Ireland I think we know in all sectors, in the kind of, whether it comes to clinical practice or research, we are to some extent all a bit stretched and under-resourced, whether it comes to staffing issues or resources or infrastructure. But we do want to get to a point where we do have research and be able to offer this to our patients. So you just have to persevere and be proactive. And as I said, having the time commitment, it was fortuitous for me that I was doing research at the time. So things, there are certain that allow you to be proactive and engaged, but I think that is a very important aspect of the process.
Yes, definitely. So I give just quickly the most important points, and then we go immediately to questions if there are any. But so as you pointed out, so really paramount in conjunction with Cancer Trials Ireland is you get in contact with the DSSG as early as possible, discuss your idea. You know, that's a really good feedback session there. Then the next step is really like, if the DSSG is happy, it will go through a peer review process. And then from the peer review process, and I'm not even talking about all the parallel things behind the scene which you had to do, then from there it goes to the SMG. And in your case, for example, it was approved, but it was approved pending positive outcome of the funding decision. That was absolutely necessary, you know, because we cannot approve a study when the funding is still up in the air. So it was approved before this came through, but it was pending that decision. And then it was full steam ahead, and then it is in the full process and it goes its way. So just to give that as a quick summary. So do we have any questions? There was nobody has written any comments. So no, there was a comment from Jaroshka saying that it is always very difficult. Oh, that's how it is always with the challenges, but we don't have any questions here. Is there anything?
Farina, could I make a comment? Roshni
Absolutely.
here. I was so glad to be able to join this, and Roshni, that was a really great overview. I think for those of us who have done something similar through different mechanisms, potentially, I think we've all had the same challenges with funding and with people changing their minds about what they will and won't support, and trying to come to the right design. But I think what's very clear is that you had the protected time to work on this, and it took you 2 years to get this off the ground, despite putting a huge amount of effort in. And this is the type of project that people can do if they're in a protected research fellowship. And this is oftentimes what we experience when we go to centres abroad. So I think, you know, if we want to have this type of opportunity in Ireland, I think we need to look for more avenues for protected research time for trainees, but also for investigators, because as you know, there's very few people in the country from an oncology perspective who have protected research time to get these types of investigator-initiated projects off the ground. And I think that the HRB, with their new funding model, has suggested that this is a very important thing for us as a country, is to be able to develop academic studies that are homegrown from our researchers, our basic scientists, etc. And that's exactly what Roshni has done here. So I think we need to just, I suppose, think of that as we move forward and support people who want to do this, which is what she has experienced.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more about the time, and I see it myself, and I've taken up a clinical post. You know, Anne-Marie and Orla have probably noticed my response time has significantly increased, you know, as a result. So that is a very kind of, you know, a big circumstance that really affects the progress of the study for sure.
This is Evelyn. Roshni, that presentation was amazing. I
Oh,
mean, we've
you.
been trying to explain how to bring a trial to Cancer Trials Ireland, and I think this was a really, really good way of doing it. I want to kind of use your presentation again and again,
Sure.
and the recording here. I'm sure Ken has got lots of ideas. And just for the people who are sitting there and maybe trainees or people who have ideas and they're wondering, please just take on board some of the advice. But also, we're trying to find ways to shorten that time, you know, between coming up with an idea. And like, I have a real problem, and Verena knows this, with the peer review process. I lost it recently at a board meeting over the whole thing. And Rob O'Connor said, look, Evelyn, that's the way it is with us as well in the Irish Cancer Society. So I know it's tough, but we want to find ways to kind of make that process a little quicker. Because when we were talking about that, I know it can take a few months to get, and it's because you're relying on volunteers to come back. You know, and you're relying on goodwill, which I think is incredible in the research community throughout the world, that's available. But we have to find kind of quicker ways to get that done. But look, overall, thank you so much, and I hope we will learn from what you've said as well in terms of how to make this a quicker process. I really appreciated what you said about the team in Cancer Trials Ireland. We've got Orla and Anne-Marie in translational, and we've got the same kind of people in our drug trial space, in our radiotherapy space, and all very committed, and we really appreciated hearing that back. We didn't pay her to say any of that, by the way.
No, you didn't. No, I can show you emails from Orla on a bank holiday Monday at 10 p.m. or at 6 a.m. or on a Friday at 11 p.m. You know, I mean, there's a lot of hard work from
on both sides.
The two, well, from the two girls I worked with, for sure.
Yeah, and I think I'd echo that as well, you know, Orla, and I think Anne-Marie will come in there as well. Roshni is, you know, the engagement is superb, you know, it's always welcomed, you know, and that is, you've said it about communication, but I think we would certainly echo it. It helps to keep the momentum up. It helps us, you know, it helps everybody. So that engagement with you has been superb. It also, I think, helps the team learn so much about the study, because when you're talking to investigators and when you engage like that, it lifts it off the page. And for us, you know, you know more what's happening in the clinic. You've got more of a feel for what's happening when we speak to you, and you get that engagement. And then I think that feeds into the design, and we understand then the problems that are there or what can be challenging. So I think that is something certainly with that engagement that, as I say, it lifts it more off of the page, you know, and you can really see it more. It's always great to have that support all the time for all questions. You know, what you think is the bigger ones, or maybe what you think is the smaller one, but it's a bit of a niggling worry. And you know, when you can speak to somebody and who knows it so well, and it's your lead person, and they resolve that for you, it's just invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. I echo that too. And I joined Cancer Trials Ireland actually in June 2018, and this was one of my first studies. So I was really thrown in the deep end, but no, it was very enjoyable. It was a great experience, and yeah, I learned an awful lot too. There's my little pumpkin here.
Thank you very much.
So thanks for everything, Roshni.
Oh, not at all. Thank you, girl.
Anybody else with a question or a comment? I know it is Friday. It's 5 o'clock.
I'm on another call, so I'm going to go. But and thanks everyone. So I might leave now.
Thanks, Evelyn.
And I think, you know, we since there's no more questions and comments, I draw it to a close. I thank you again very much, Roshni. I think it was a fantastic session and we all learned from it. And to everybody who was listening, if you have questions, just get back to us. If you have an idea, come back to us as well anytime. Thank you very much and have a great weekend.
Thank you, Marina.
Thanks, Roshni.
Bye.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just doing the recording on my laptop, so I just need to press stop on the laptop there. Are you there? Shit.